This video lecture is on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So we are going to be discussing virtue ethics, but specifically Aristotle's virtue ethics. Aristotle was a student of Plato, who was an informal student of Socrates, and Aristotle is really the person who begins systematizing philosophy, and he's the person really that was responsible for someone like Thomas Aquinas to really kind of revolutionize, Christian philosophy in the medieval era. And today his kind of teleological philosophy has a bit fallen off and not become as prominent as, of course, it was through most of the history of Western philosophy. But nonetheless, he was extremely influential, and there's a lot to learn from, in this case, his ethics. So we'll be focusing on books 1 and 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics in this lecture video, and some of the major claims that we will discuss is the idea that ethics is a quest for the good, the capital G good, not just a good, but the good, the greatest thing that one can achieve, and that is a flourishing life. And of course, later on we will kind of explain in further detail, get at what exactly is a flourishing life. What does it mean to have flourished? Another major claim, all things aim at some final end, which is the cause of their being. So, the reason why you exist is for some purpose. And you achieving that purpose is the reason then why you exist. So to be virtuous, to be good, is to excellently achieve that end. Finally, it is possible to attain a life of virtuous activities together with friends. That it's not enough just for you to try and be good, but it requires other people as well who are good that you work together with, right? And this is why I think there's this, famous quote from Aristotle in the Politics where he says, man is a social animal. And it really, you have to take to heart this idea that we are beings which are necessarily interdependent on one another. So Aristotle's philosophy is teleological. That means that he focuses on the ends for why things exist. So for him, nature itself is what we can call an end and a that for the sake of which. So all things that exist aim at some end. He says in the Physics, in things that come from art, then, we make the material for the sake of the work. But in natural things, it is in being from the beginning. So natural things, those which have a source of motion within themselves, whereas, something like a rock, it requires, like me to push the rock for it to move. Natural things have that source of motion that comes from within inside them. However, there are 3 kinds of souls that we can find in natural things. So plants have what he calls a nutritive soul. These are souls which just take in nutrients, like the soil, breathing in carbon dioxide, or through photosynthesis, the power from the sun, from the light, and those things help it grow and achieve its end, So what is the end of a plant? Well, it would be to successfully harvest all the energy and nutrients from whether that's photosynthesis or otherwise, to grow, to survive the elements, to have seeds, which then give rise to other plants. Now an animal has, yes, a nutritive soul, but it also has a desiring soul. It has a soul which desires things, where it says, I want such and such, I want to eat. Plants don't have this desire of, I want to eat. They just eat. So animals, their end is to successfully animal. So like let's say a tiger, okay? A successful tiger is one that can, hunt well, that can, when it needs to be stealthy, that can, when it needs to, raise its young such that they can be, successful tigers. And so then to, have sex and give rise to more tigers. And a tiger is going to be able to do that if, through its desires, it does that successfully, as opposed to kind of doing kind of dumb things is like, maybe chasing something and not paying attention to its surroundings such that it like falls off a cliff, right? Then it wouldn't have tigered that well because it wouldn't have, achieved its end like another tiger might do. Now, human beings, yes, humans have nutritive souls and a desiring soul, but unlike other non-human animals, humans have reason. They have a rational soul. They have a soul which allows them to, almost in the third person think like, okay, I desire cake, but I want to lose weight, so should I eat cake right now? And a good human being, right, is where we said a good plant, it plants, it does planting things. A good animal does animal things, for it to survive, for it to, in the case of like a beaver, builds dams, a beaver wouldn't be achieving its end if it didn't build dams, right? What is the purpose of a human being, right? And why is it that it has a rational soul? How does that affect its purpose, right? Well, we're going to see some human souls fulfill their final cause better than others. And so what is that final cause? So before we get at what the final cause is, we have to understand something about causality and our actions as human beings. So every action aims at something, right? Aristotle says in the first line of the Nicomachean Ethics, every art and every inquiry, and likewise every action and choice. So whether or not you're a carpenter or a painter, whether or not you are a philosopher or a physicist, whether or not you are a football player or you are, wanting to eat cake instead of strawberries. All those different things, he says, they seem to aim at some good. And hence, it has been beautifully said that the good is that at which all things aim. So what would be, the good of a carpenter? Well, building potentially, right, if I'm building a house, well, building a house that does things that we want a house to do, like not collapse, to provide shelter from the outside, to, potentially provide for a family, such that a family can actually live in the house, things like that. A football player, well, to, if it's soccer, we're talking about football, soccer, score goals. If we're talking about American football, well, maybe to throw touchdown passes, to not get injured, right, to be as fit as possible, and so on. So all those things have specific ends, and yet, right, there is a difference among ends. So some are ways of being at work, others are certain kinds of works produced. So some of the actions, some of the pursuits we undertake, some of these things are themselves just ways of being at work, like painting. But some things are kinds of works produced, such that by, like me right now teaching, I am educating. So many actions and arts produce different ends. So the kind of knowledge required for, let's say, to be a doctor, right? This medical knowledge, that is concerned with good health. So it has the end of health, which is different from a shipbuilder. A shipbuilder is not concerned with the good of health. It is concerned with the good of building a boat that successfully does things that we want a boat to do, right? The purpose of a boat. The art of war is concerned with victory, not with, successfully healing a patient who, has pancreatitis. Or a household management, is concerned with wealth. So all our different actions have different ends, and yet, for Aristotle, the good, capital G good, is that at which everything aims. It is the reason for which an activity is undertaken in the first place. So even though I might play soccer, right, to score goals, to win games, to win the World Cup, I don't do it simply just, I don't play soccer just simply to win the World Cup. I play soccer for another good, which actually is going to be a good that what a carpenter also does besides building a house, right? So whether these be crafts, investigations, actions, or decisions. So if it were the case that one of these disciplines, or as Aristotle refers to it as science, just an area of inquiry, is subordinate to another, the ends of the higher science are more trustworthy than those of the lower. And what he means by that is, if it were the case that you had, let's say, being an educator is more superior to being a doctor because, let's say you can't be a doctor before you've been educated, and so you need an educator to educate you. Well, we would see that with those, in those cases, you would only just be doing one thing as a means to an end, and that end, once it's done, you do something else that, yes, was made possible by what you did before, but it's simply just for, tomorrow or something like that. Aristotle says, though, we do not choose everything for the sake of something else. It is not just the case that I decide to go to school to get an education because I want to get a degree, and I wanted to get a degree because I want to get a good job, and I want to get a job just because, I want to make money, right? That there is some highest end, which all those different ends aim at. And the reason is, if it were the case that I only went to school to get a degree, and I only wanted to get a degree because I only wanted to get a job, and I only wanted to get a job because I only wanted to make money, it would be irrational. Because every choice would have no real foundation, no real reason behind it. It would just all be contingent, based on where you live, where you grow up. There would be nothing that really rationally serves as a foundation for why we do what we do. And if we want to know how do we live a good life, we need to know, is playing football just as good as, being a doctor? Is it just as choice-worthy or something like that, right? And so for Aristotle, that means if there is to be a rational purpose for all of our activities, all of our actions, and he thinks there is, there must be some highest good which all those actions aim at. Right? And so on that list of things of getting a degree, to get a job, to make money, right? I could ask, okay, why do you want to make money? Usually people say, well, eventually they say, I want to be happy. Why do you want to be happy? And what do we mean by happiness? Right? It seems like there is something we actually all seem like we feel like is the best thing we can do, or a purpose in life. But what is that? Right? Well, it would be what is the good, the capital G, good. So, Aristotle wants to distinguish himself a little bit from his teacher Plato. And here Aristotle gives what I think we can call a, Platonic interpretation of the good, as opposed to, I think, what we would say Plato's interpretation. Because what Plato's actual opinion is, it's pretty unclear. But as Aristotle states it, in Platonism, the good is the form which all instances of good things are representations of. So, for example, a painting of a mountainside that we might say beautiful is a representation of the actual mountain that actually exists in the world. And we would say the painting is good because it accurately depicts, to some extent, the reality of the mountain that is actually good. So, in Platonism, there's this idea that the good is that which makes possible all the other things, in the sense that they all, to some degree, have an aspect of that thing. So, a painting, if we say it's beautiful, of, let's say, a person, the painting shares somewhat the resemblance of course, the person, but it's not as beautiful as the person, because for you to have a painting of the person, it can't have all the totality of the person, because that's why it's a painting. There's something it lacks. It's just a representation of it. So the person would then be necessarily more beautiful than the painting. But why is the person beautiful? Well, the idea would be because the person takes part in beautifulness itself, right? So there would be the separate form, immaterial, ideal form of beauty, which a person would end up sharing an instance of the beautiful, which is why we are able to recognize it as being beautiful. So Aristotle says, and some people believe that besides these many good things, there is some other good by itself which is also responsible for the being good of all these other things, which would be this good as is understood in Platonism. But, Aristotle looks at all these different philosophers in his time, and he says all of them, or even just common people, all of them have these different conceptions of the good. And he says, yet, if, the case of Platonism of the good were true, you would find that they all share one form of the good. They all share in it, and yet they don't. He says, since the good is meant in just as many ways as being is, it is clear that there could not be any common good that is one and universal. For, in the sense of what something is, the good is spoken of as the God, or intellect, right? So, maybe from a more religious perspective, we would say that the good is, the God, a God, or intellect. In the sense of being of a certain sort, it is spoken of as the excellences. So when we talk about, oh yeah, that's a good pencil. Well, why? Because it, writes well. That's a bit different from speaking of the good as God. So in the sense of being a proper amount, right, it is spoken of as being a proper limit to the extent that, 10 kilos of, or I should say maybe 10 gallons of gas is good, for the car. It'll get us there. Well, it's the proper limit that we need to get to our location. In the sense of being related to something, he says, it is spoken of as being useful. In the sense of being some time, it is spoken of as an opportune moment. And in the sense of place, it is spoken of as a dwelling or other things of that sort. So you have all these different ways in which the good is spoken of, and yet they don't come under one single shared form. He says, for if there were, it could not have been meant in all the ways of attributing being, but it would only be in one, that in all the ways in which we speak of the good, they would all mean in the same way, and yet Aristotle says they don't. So what then is the good? So the ends of our actions are not complete, right? Since they are ends for other things, in the same way that, you being a student and you successfully completing this course, that end is not complete, because the good is something complete, and yet you completing this course, you have not fulfilled yourself. You've only fulfilled one thing about yourself, right, that is on the way to fulfilling yourself. Because, of course, when you finish this class, you don't just simply get your degree because you finished this one class. So the good then must be something complete, because we have all these different goods where we say, as a football player, I want to score goals. Okay, great, you scored a goal. Does that mean you flourished as a football player? Well, what if you won the game because you scored the goal? Or what if the game you won was the World Cup, right? Notice all these are different ends we can achieve, but they're not complete because they can lead to something else. If there is to be a highest good of which all our actions aim, for Aristotle, it's clear that that good must be something complete, where there's nothing, left afterwards. It can't be a means to an end. It is the end in itself. It is that for which the sake of everything else is done. So for Aristotle, he tries to say that a thing pursued on account of itself, right, is more complete than something pursued for the sake of something else. And the complete is what is chosen always for itself and never on account of anything else. So the good, which politics and which everyone aims at, the highest good, he says, is happiness, which is exactly, if we were doing this class in purpose and I went and asked you, why are you getting an education? Why do you want a job? Why do you want money? And so on, right? Usually everyone comes to the word happiness. They say, well, I want to be happy, or I want my family to be happy. So potentially then happiness can be the good. But what is meant by happiness? Because again, many people mean happiness in many different ways. Aristotle says some people take it to be happiness to be something visible and obvious, such as pleasure or wealth or honor. When sick, one thinks it's health, but when poor, one thinks that it's wealth, right? And so happiness then is these different things based on your state at that, one given time, that's happiness. It's being healthy, or that when you're poor, happiness is being wealthy. So he says most people do assume that pleasure is the good, and that is what happiness is. It is pleasure. So there are three conceptions of happiness, he says, based on the lives that people lead, right? So he looks out in society and he says, okay, people end up pursuing three different kinds of happiness. One he calls the vulgar. Vulgar people, lead a life of gratification, and they identify happiness with pleasure. So whether this be through drugs or food or through wealth, anything like that, right? He calls that a vulgar life because such a life is fit only for animals. And why? Because it's going to satisfy the desiring part of the soul, right? Pleasure, when you pleasure yourself, you are satisfying the desiring part of your soul. And of course, right, that's the highest end for animals. But human beings have something more, right? We have the rational soul. So we need to take account of the rational soul because that, in essence, is what distinguishes us from animals for Aristotle, that we have reason. So what about honor? The people he calls the cultivated, these lead an active life and identify happiness with honor. So potentially politicians or celebrities, right? People like that want to be famous, that want to be held in high regard by other people. Potentially that's better than the vulgar with, when they identify happiness with pleasure, but still he says that is secondary to goodness. That honor, yes, it's required to be a good person, but it is not goodness itself. He says the studious have another conception, and it is the studious that correctly identify what true happiness is, precisely because it is based on successfully completing the purpose of having a rational soul. So Aristotle says, so what is sought will belong to the happy person, who will be happy throughout life, for such a person will always, or most of all people, be acting and contemplating the things that go along with virtue, and will bear what fortune brings most beautifully and in complete harmony in every instance, being in the true sense good and flawlessly squarely centered. Because people like philosophers, and this is who he thinks are the studious, right? Philosophers have this conception of the good as a thing in itself, right? That you study wisdom for the sake of, just wisdom being a good in and of itself. Not because it's going to make you rich, not because it's going to bring you pleasure, not because it's going to make you honorable among others, but because it is just the most beautiful thing in itself. So, the happiness that is the highest good is in the Greek eudaimonia. So eudaimonia is a kind of flourishing. So it's often translated as happiness, but what Aristotle is speaking of is not a kind of happiness that you have sex and so you're happy, or you win a game and so you're happy, right? Or you have your first child and so you're happy. The kind of happiness he speaks of is a kind of flourishing, right? So this is a better translation of eudaimonia. Flourishing is not something that children and animals experience, since, as we'll see later, for him, right, children and animals do not make choices. Now, children have the capacity to make choices, but only when they get older, and animals never have the capacity to make choices because it requires the rational soul. They cannot distance themselves from what is immediate, right? They can't think, animals can't think, yeah, I'm hungry, but I'm going to eat actually in an hour instead of right now, right? They're just hungry, I'm going to go get food. Now, a child has to learn, right, to kind of think of themselves in the third person, to step back, right, reflexively. I don't want to eat right now. I need to do this other thing instead, and then I can eat later. Right? A child has to learn that. That takes experience. So, children and animals cannot distance themselves from what is immediate in order to give preference to something remote that is recommended only by reason or beauty. So, flourishing then, right, what this requires is something complete. It is something self-sufficient, and it is therefore the end of actions. Flourishing is something we do because it is just good. And all of our actions, whether it's trying to be the best soccer player we can, or the best doctor we can, the best parent we can, ultimately all of those is to be a good person, because to be a good person is to live a flourishing life. Right? So remember, all things have different ends. We talked about the ends of a plant, the ends of an animal like a tiger. What is the end of a human being? And why is it that some human beings can complete the end of being a human being better than others? Well, the end of a human being is to flourish. And flourishing is a being at work of the soul in accordance with complete virtue. So it is to reach the full potential of what the rational soul allows us to do, and that is to develop and cultivate the virtues, both virtues of character and intellectual virtues. Some human beings do not develop these virtues. Other human beings do develop those virtues. So Aristotle says, if the work of a human being is a being at work of the soul in accordance with reason, just as the case of a serious harpist is to play the harp well, while this life consists of a being at work of the soul and actions that go along with reason, and it belongs to a man of serious stature to do these things well and beautifully, the human good comes to be disclosed as a being at work of the soul in accordance with virtue, and if the virtues are more than one, in accordance with the best and most complete virtue. But also this must be in a complete life. So, to live a flourishing life, and so therefore to be a good person, you cannot be a good person when you are 10 years old. You cannot be a good person when you are still a teenager. You are a good person at the end of your life, because it takes hard work. It takes a full lifetime of experiences to develop all these virtues such that you then can be said to have flourished as a human being. Which is why, right, it is something that is choice-worthy for its own sake. Because, of course, if it is a complete life, both meaning complete in that, you have developed all the things one would want to do in a life, but also at the end of your life, right, you've accomplished all these things finally, then in that sense, you don't do it because, you want money, you do it just for its own sake. So, we said that there are two different kinds of virtue. And this is because the soul is twofold, right? There's an irrational part of the soul and a rational part of the soul. And then even within the irrational part, right, as we've already seen, that is twofold. So there's the nutritive part and desiring part, which ends up listening and is able to obey the rational part of the soul. So virtue is two sorts then. One pertains to thinking and the other to character. So that which pertains to thinking is developing the rational part of the soul. That which pertains to character is developing the desiring part of the soul. So thinking comes into being, right, through education and experience, Aristotle says, and character comes into being by habit, because to develop a good character, you need to constantly work on this such that it just becomes what you do. It is who you are. When we say someone has a good character, it's just because they kind of exhibit this naturalness about how they act, how they go about the world, as opposed to someone who has to constantly think and then they make mistakes, right? That person is either has a bad character or they're in the process of developing a good character, but they don't yet have a truly good character, right? Because a good character, Aristotle says, does not arise in us naturally, but it requires repetitive training. Just as in, if you were learning to be a carpenter, you have to constantly work on things, or becoming a doctor, you have to work on your sutures, or other things like that, right? So to be a good person, you want to develop virtues of character and the intellectual virtues. But what are virtues? The Greek word is arete. Arete means the excellence that makes anything an outstanding specimen of its kind, and that means it is something especially well fitted to its ends. So, if virtue is a kind of excellence, does that mean it involves feeling? Is it a predisposition? Is it an active condition? Well, if it were a feeling, then it would be something which we would always have to wait for, that moment to feel it, and then we act according to how we feel. So it can't be, virtue can't be a feeling then, because if it were habitual, it wouldn't rely on feelings, it would just be something we do. But feelings can play a part in developing the virtues, because of course, as we get older, we come to realize how different things feel, whether that be if we hurt someone, right, and that might feel bad. Or we do something and it feels good, like working out, right? And eventually becoming healthier feels good. So feelings can direct us, but virtues are not feelings. What about a predisposition? Well, if virtue is a predisposition, then it wouldn't require, cultivating a habit, because we would already be predisposed to act virtuously. So you instead cultivate, right, virtuous dispositions. So what does that mean? Virtues are active conditions. They are active conditions because, as you know, when we become virtuous, we, for example, are trustworthy or we are honest because we are just actively, right? We have developed this condition of being actively honest, where we don't have to think about it, it's just who we are. As Aristotle says, right? Therefore, virtue is an active condition that makes one apt at choosing, consistent in a mean condition in relation to us, which is determined by a proportion and by the means by which a person with practical judgment would determine it. So, virtues of character. We develop these virtues by aiming at the golden mean. So we don't do this with intellectual virtues, only with virtues of character. So the agent must be in the right state to produce an action well. They have to know that they are performing a virtuous action. They have to decide on the virtuous action. And they have to decide on the action from a firm and unchanging state. And these conditions can be met only if one does things the way a virtuous person does, which is why in virtue ethics, they often talk about sages, right? Or the virtuous person as kind of like the model. And you think, what would a virtuous person do in this situation? Now, of course, the virtuous person doesn't have to think about that because it's just who they are, and so they just act virtuously. But when we want to learn about how to be virtuous, we have to, right, use our ability to reason and ask, what would a virtuous person do in this situation? And if it is a virtue of character that we're talking about, these aim at a mean between extremes of feelings, right? So this is again when feelings can help guide us towards being virtuous, but feelings in themselves are not virtues. So things such as virtues are of such a nature as to be destroyed by deficiency and excess, as we see in the case of strength and health. For excessive gymnastic exercises as well as deficient ones destroy one's strength, and similarly drink and food, when they become too much or too little, destroy one's health, while proportionate amounts produce, increase, and preserve these. So what does he mean? Well, think about this. You want to develop the virtue of being, for Aristotle, there's not this virtue, but if there were a virtue of being a good football player, you would not want to exercise too much. If you exercise in excess, then you risk, of course, injuring yourself, right? You can strain your muscles. Now, of course, if you are deficient in exercising or in practice, well, then you're not going to be very good out on the field. So you want to strike a balance between exercising too much and exercising too little, right? You want to find that perfect balance. And that means it's contextual, because for certain things, right, like let's say the virtue of courage, for certain things, you might want to be more courageous, and for some things, less courageous. Now, in the case of, let's say there's a bear that comes into a campsite, you don't want to be too courageous, because then you could end up being rash, or you end up, charging a bear. That would not be a good idea. But you don't want to be, you don't want to have a deficiency of courage, because then you could end up acting cowardly. And to act cowardly, right, well, then maybe you run away and you don't save, your wife or kids, from the bear, right? You don't, do the best you can to prevent them from being attacked by the bear. Now, on the other hand, let's say you come into a situation where you are called upon to take a leadership role. Well, you probably want to be pretty courageous to display that, yes, I'm the right person for this job, and I can do all the tasks that are required of me. So that might require a bit more courage, right, than, of course, it would with, potentially a bear. Now, of course, if we mean courage by confronting something head-on, it can be a bit messy what we're talking about in terms of excess. But, let's say, okay, do you attack the bear as opposed to, attacking a person? Let's say a person is going to try to mug you. Well, to defend yourself, you don't want to be too cowardly. But you probably want to be a bit more rash than you would with the bear, because you can probably defend yourself better, in hand-to-hand combat against a person than you can a bear. So these virtues of character, right, they are contextual. Sometimes you want to have more excess in one case than in another case, but you still don't want to go too much, because there's always going to be an extreme in the case of excess or deficiency. So, in becoming virtuous, right, we want to develop these different virtues of character. Some of these are like courage, temperance, justice. But we also want to develop virtues of mind. Now, virtues of mind do not, we should not understand them according to, working according to the golden mean, because there is no excess of practical wisdom, right? There is only a deficiency. There is no excess of philosophical wisdom. There is only a deficiency. And there is no excess of friendship. There is only a deficiency of friendship and of, good friendship. And so what do we mean by practical wisdom? Practical wisdom is just kind of like the know-how, right? The ability to achieve a certain end, right? Like, I need to drive to work, and I need to get there on time, so I need to know when I need to leave, right? So I need to be someone who's timely. Philosophical wisdom is not concerned with, a means to an end. Instead, it's concerned with things for their own sake, like, studying ethics, okay? It's concerned with, you develop the virtue of philosophical wisdom by, learning about virtue and philosophy in the first place. But that is not a means to an end, like, let's say, being a good carpenter, right? That might require practical wisdom because you have to end up developing the know-how to be a good carpenter, right? To become a master carpenter. Whereas someone who's a novice isn't going to have the skill because they won't have developed the practical wisdom yet to be a master carpenter. So there are these different stages, right, that you go through where you have, if you want to understand the development of how one becomes a good person, how one becomes virtuous, there are these different stages of where you have this kind of immature ego, like a child, where you act on your impulse and feelings and you probably oppose morals. Then when you want to actually start becoming virtuous, yourself begins to mature, so you become to be obedient to moral guidance. You develop a sense of honor, and you start to develop your moral behavioral virtues. And finally, right, a mature, rational person, they end up choosing their own goals and values, and they do so by developing both moral and then intellectual virtues. So we can see here on this table this different list of, so we said of the intellectual virtues, right, there's practical wisdom and philosophical wisdom. Of the virtues of character, there are a lot more virtues, but this graph helps us to break it up to see, okay, what are the vices? These are the virtues in excess of either, right, too much or a deficiency, so the two extremes. We want the golden mean, so you want to be modest. You don't want to be bashful, and you don't want to be shameless, but you want to be modest to be a good person. You want to be truthful. You want to be witty. You want to be just. You want to be friendly. You want to have a good temper, right ambition, high-mindedness. You want to be temperate, and you want to be courageous, right? So you always want to ask yourself in a given situation, right? What would a virtuous person do? Would this require the virtue of modesty? Would this require the virtue of a good temper? Okay, so maybe you want to be a good student. Well, does being a good student require friendliness? Does it require right ambition? Does it require courage? Does it require wittiness? To what degree does it require wittiness? To what degree might it require truthfulness, right? All those things, the virtuous person, the sage, they would just know, so they don't have to think about it because they've developed, right, it into their character, that that's just who they are. But when you want to become virtuous, you have to ask in these situations. Like, let's say there's a philosophical dilemma of a person who, they just lost their job, they need to feed their family. There's a baker who left a bunch of bread outside the store, okay? Would a virtuous person take that bread would they just take that bread because they don't have money to pay for it, just take it to go feed their family so their family doesn't starve? Or would they not do that because, that would be stealing, right? What would a virtuous person do? Would it require courage, or by stealing the bread, would that be a vice of being rash? Would this be, if you were caught, right? And then in being caught, so let's say you take the bread, you're on the way back home to give the bread to your family. Someone catches you and asks you, were you stealing this bread? Well, should you be truthful to what extent, right? Because if you say yes, well, they might take the bread away. your family doesn't get fed, they starve. Should you lie? Is it always wrong to lie in virtue ethics? Well, not always. Sometimes you might want to lie. I mean, if someone asks you a question, sometimes we want to tell white lies because we don't want to hurt the person's feeling, and the issue they ask us about really isn't that important. But sometimes we do need to tell the truth because the issue is more important. So, to what extent, in that hypothetical situation, a virtuous person probably would tell the truth, but they probably would tell the truth in such a way that might try to get them off the hook, of course. So they might have the virtue of modesty. They might have the virtue of just resentment, of resenting their actions, of admitting, yes, what I did is wrong, but I'm doing it because, a virtuous person loves their family, and they would, just take a couple loaves of bread to go feed their family. So, to recap books 1 and 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, the highest end is the good. What is the good? It is happiness. It is eudaimonia, which is a kind of flourishing. Flourishing is a being at work of the soul in accordance with complete virtue. Virtue is the excellence that makes anything an outstanding specimen of its kind, which is especially well fitted to its ends. And for virtues of character, right, the golden mean is that mean between two extremes, which are what virtues are, right? So that's what a virtuous person aims at, is being modest as opposed to being like bashful, for example. So for a discussion question, I thought it would be really interesting to get your take on, what is the best life? So Aristotle's conception of the best life is that a philosophical life, a life of contemplation. But do you think that's true? Would the best life be a kind of happiness through pleasure? Would the best life be a kind of happiness through, honor, like maybe like a celebrity or a politician or a war hero? Is happiness even the end which we should strive for? Or do you have a different conception of what the best life is?